I want to pick up on what I was saying this morning, and I want to give the good news. I think it's a great temptation in the times at which we live. There's a twofold temptation. There's a temptation to despair, and there's a temptation to anger, neither of which I think are legitimate responses, or wholly legitimate responses for the Christian. Despair, of course, is never a legitimate position for a Christian to hold. The New Testament presents a great picture of hope. Hope is one of the Christian virtues, and therefore, as we look at the chaos around us, despair is not an option. Anger, I think, has its proper place in the Christian life, but we always need to be careful that in our anger we do not sin. And a despairing anger, of course, would by definition be a sinful anger. So what I want to do in this lecture is offer some threads of hope relative to the changes that are taking place in our culture. And I want to start, though, by capturing what I think is the human dilemma. I said at the start of the first lecture that the big problem we all know with human beings is our fallen nature, the fact that we live in a fallen world. Sin has been the great problem ever since the fall. And all generations have had their own particular idioms for expressing sin and their own particular ways of doing so. And that binds our era, as spectacularly chaotic as it is, with all eras that are past. And I want to suggest that one way of thinking about sin is this. All sin, whenever it occurs in history, involves desecration. Human beings made in the image of God. What is sin? Sin is a desecration of that image. It can be a desecration when we do it to others. Murder, for example, is a desecration of the image of God. And it can be desecration when we do it to ourselves, when we behave in ways that we are not designed to do. That, I think, both explains something and also gives us ground for hope. What does it explain? It explains the exultant nature of so much of sin. Those of you who've studied any sociology will know that one of the standard categories for understanding modernity, for understanding the modern world, is that of disenchantment. Coined by Max Weber, the great German sociologist, the idea is that as modernity has progressed, as industrialization has progressed, as bureaucracies have developed, as modern life has grown, so the world has become a less magical place. We might say, connecting that to the narrative I told in my first lecture, that helps explain why the world starts to look like raw material. It ceases to have a magical power of its own and becomes a lump of cosmic Play-Doh, which we can make into anything we wish. But I think that only gets us so far. That explains why we come to think of things as raw material, for example. It explains how we come to think of other people as objects, as things, not subjects and persons. But it doesn't explain the enthusiasm for these things. And one of the striking things, it seems to me, about the sexual revolution and the gender revolution is the exultant jubilation that accompanies it. I was making the comment in a lecture yesterday. I said there's a big shift in attitudes to abortion from, say, in the early 90s, when in America the statement was abortion should be safe, legal, and rare. In other words, it's kind of an evil, but we have to have it. To women now, so say, shouting their abortions and wearing T-shirts that proclaim the fact they've had an abortion. It's one thing, if you like, to sin and be ashamed of it. It's another thing to sin and exult in it. And we live in an era where people exult in sin. We live in an era where great delight is taken in transgression. And I want to read here a passage it's from one of the Russian writer Dostoevsky's shorter books. It's not one of his great novels. It's from the book that in English, the title is Notes from a Dead House. It's his semi-fictionalized account of the 7 years he spent as a prisoner in Siberia in a prison camp there. And one of the interesting things about this book is that Dostoevsky, being Dostoevsky, engages in analytical pen portraits of the various people he encounters in the prison. And one of the people he encounters is a very sophisticated nobleman. And Dostoevsky discovers that this very gentlemanly and sophisticated nobleman is in prison because he's killed quite a lot of people. And Dostoevsky is fascinated by this. He's confronted, you might say, with, we have the term in English now, serial killer. Dostoevsky would not have had the term, but that's clearly what this man is. And Dostoevsky is interested in what makes this genteel, sophisticated nobleman. What turned him into such a monster? And he writes this. It was as if, he says, having leapt over a line that was sacred to him, he begins to admire the fact that nothing is holy for him anymore. As if he feels an urge to leap over all legality and authority at once, and to revel in the most boundless and unbridled freedom, to revel in this thrill of horror, which it is impossible for him not to feel. What I want you to notice there is the language of the sacred that Dostoevsky uses. He comes to the conclusion that what motivates this man is the fact that he's transgressed the bounds of holiness. He's done something unholy, and he's found that thrilling and compelling because it makes him feel powerful. I was reading an essay just the other week by a queer theorist arguing for what in America is called drag queen story hour. And this was an article, an academic article, arguing that drag queen story hour should be a very important part of elementary school education in the United States. What struck me, queer theory, by the way, is generally very badly written. It's opaque stuff. It's part of the game. They want to confuse you. They want to confuse all categories by writing in a very confusing way. But at the middle of this article, there was a very lucid passage. And what the writer said was this. He says, let's be clear. The purpose of this is desecration. It's very, very clear. The purpose of this is to trample on all that was once considered holy. If you look at some of the great analysts of early modernity, Karl Marx and Friedrich Nietzsche, Sharon mentioned in her wonderful lecture just a short while ago, when you look at Marx and Nietzsche, they often use the language of sacrilege. The Communist Manifesto talks about the impact of modernity and says, all that is sacred is profaned. When Nietzsche talks about the death of God in the gay science, he talks about, how can we have done this? How can we have slain the holiest of the holies? What sacred rites must we now invent to compensate for our crime? What festivals of atonement must we develop? It is the essence of our age, I think, to desecrate. And desecration is an exciting and exhilarating thing. That's what we're up against. That's, if you like, some bad news. What's the good news? The good news is this. If the human problem is desecration, then the answer is consecration. And that's useful to know because then we can step away and say, well, okay, I haven't got to master queer theory. I haven't got to master the incidentals of the revolution of desecration that we are in the midst of. I have to understand the instruments of consecration. And that's, I think, where things start to get much simpler for us. Because the answer to desecration is consecration, and the instrument of consecration is, as it has always been, the church. And I want us to think in this lecture about three particular aspects of the church that I think are perennials of church existence. But what I want to do is bring out particular aspects of these three perennials that are particularly potent in addressing the problems we currently face. I'm going to cut forward a little bit on my handout at this point and say, part of my inspiration for this is, as I mentioned earlier on, I'm a historian. We are all shaped, I think, by the callings we have, the jobs we pursue, the skills we have. Engineers will approach problems in particular ways. Mathematicians, I know, always approach problems in peculiarly weird ways. I don't know if that goes with the territory. As a historian, when I'm faced with a problem, my instinct is, are there precedents in history that will allow me to address this problem, or will perhaps provide insights either from good things that were done or mistakes that were made that we can learn from? And I would suggest that the precedent for us in history is the second century church. Now, immediately, I want to flag your attention that the second century Christian church in the Roman Empire was in some ways in a very different situation to the situation we find ourselves in today. The Roman Empire had never known Christianity and was at the beginning of a process of Christianization. We in the West, I think, stand, I won't say at the beginning, but it's maybe at the midpoint of a process of de-Christianization. The direction is different for us. So there is a difference. Well, that's the good thing about analogies, of course. An analogy not only points to commonalities, but also assumes there are certain differences. The difference is we are living in a post-Christian culture rather than a pre-Christian culture. Having said that, how did the second century, what were the problems faced by the second century church that I think render it a close analogy to us today? Well, the church, I think, found itself in a culture in which it was deemed to be seditious and subversive of the common public good. That was the status of the church in the second century. One of the things I always press on students when I teach them about persecution in the early church is two things. One, persecution rarely happened across the whole Roman Empire, and not really before the 3rd century, because persecution is expensive and takes a lot of time, and it's got to be worth doing. But secondly, I say, nobody's persecuted because they believe Jesus rose from the dead. Nobody cared then, as nobody out there cares now, whether the tomb was empty or not in the secular world. What they care about is whether the views you hold are subversive of the common public order. And in the 2nd century, the church, we know this from both pagan critics and the way Christians responded to pagan critics, we know that the church was regarded as seditious. It was regarded as seditious for a number of reasons. One, the cry, Jesus is Lord, sounds terribly subversive of loyalty to Caesar. If you pledge loyalty to Jesus as king, where does Caesar fit into that picture? Are you breaking with the Pax Romana? Are you breaking with the values that hold the Roman Empire and Roman society together? Secondly, we know that there were rumors of incest that abounded. When a husband and wife who are Christians will refer to each other in certain contexts as brother and sister, all of us in this room know what's going on. But imagine hearing that as somebody who is not particularly schooled in Christianity. That sounds weird. When a husband refers to his wife as sister, that does sound creepy. It does sound weird. It does sound subversive of the common values of society. And thirdly, of course, there are rumors that Christians get together and they eat human flesh, the flesh of their God who was man, and they drink his blood. And that sounds kind of creepy too. All of this is to say the problems the church typically had in the earliest centuries were problems whereby her ethical positions or the language that she used was seen to be subversive of the common good. It's one of the reasons why the Greek apologists, the men who wrote most extensively about this and addressed Christianity to the Roman Empire, went out of their way consistently to talk about the fact that being a faithful Christian was consistent with being a good Roman citizen. Some things they weren't going to do. They weren't going to sacrifice to Caesar as a god, but they'd fight for the military, for example. It's interesting, isn't it, that the Roman word pious, which we translate as pious, originally meant somebody who embodied Roman civic values. The Greek apologists went out of their way to say that Roman piety and Christian way of life were not necessarily antithetical. And the problems they faced were the problems when Christian values did collide with Roman values, when Caesar did demand that one sacrifice to him as a god. Very similar to today. I think the issues we face today, Joe Biden, the progressive wing of the Democrat Party, I don't think they care whether I believe Jesus rose from the dead or not. That's not an issue. My views on transgenderism, my views on gay marriage, those are the things that are going to get their attention, because those are the things that are seen to be subversive of civil order. The question then becomes, so how did the church respond to this? What kind of culture war, if you like, did the church engage in? Well, by and large, the church engaged Roman culture by being a culture. The church engaged Roman culture through teaching and catechesis, through worship, and through community behavior. And I want to suggest to us today that whatever we do in the public square, we must realize that the most powerful tools that the church has are those that the church possesses by being the church. I've made this case numerous times in the United States. I'm typically criticized for being an Anabaptist, for withdrawal, etc., etc. I repudiate those claims. Nothing I say here today should stand in the way of Christians operating the public square. Secondly, I have the 2nd century on my side. The 2nd century did not change Roman society by next Wednesday, but it did completely transform it by the beginning of the 4th century. It's a low-energy approach. I mentioned Cologne Cathedral earlier. 1248, that date when Cologne Cathedral was built. It remains one of the great, magnificent monuments to human architectural genius on the face of the planet. They did not finish building it till 1880. There was a 200-300 year delay thanks to the Reformation. But as I've said many times before, nobody on that day in 1248, when the first foundation stone was laid, ever believed that they would gaze upon its magnificent spires, that they would worship within its magnificent sanctuary, but they still thought it was worth doing. One of the unspoken worldlinesses of modernity is this: we want everything to happen instantly. We want a technique that will deliver by this time next week. I want to suggest that is not the church's answer. We are not in the game of changing the world by next week. Praise God if God chooses to do that. That would be wonderful. But we're in the game of being faithful. What does that look like? Well, as I said, 3 things I want to talk about. The need for good teaching, preaching, the need for thoughtful, God-honoring worship, and the need for an intentional way of life as Christians. Let's think about the first, the need for teaching. Well, first of all, let me take a step back and say something about the church in general. Let us not forget that, and this is a very important point, this lifts a lot of weight off our shoulders. Let us not forget that the church is not a work of man. The church is an act of God. That's what I love many things about the Heidelberg Catechism, many things. But the structure itself is extremely important. In English, we say the structure of the catechism is grief, grace, and gratitude. It's slightly inaccurate. I think it would be better as misery, grace, and gratitude, but then we would lose the alliteration of the G's. 3 sections, one describing man's problem, one describing God's response to the problem, one describing man's appropriate response to God's response to the problem. Is it not beautifully significant that the church is discussed in the grace section? The church, which we can often think of as a human response to God's act in Christ, is not a human response to God's act in Christ. The church itself is a creation of God. Why is that important? That is important because it reminds us that God acts in and through the church. The power of the church does not depend upon our power. The power of the church depends upon the action of the sovereign God. And the sovereign God, I think, has given us things that work powerfully. One of the things I think that all Christians, particularly ministers, dominees, but also congregants need to have is a good theology of preaching. Talking with Sharon last night about preaching in Britain, and I didn't make this comment then, but I think one of the problems with a lot of preaching in Britain and in North America is that preachers have no theology of preaching. If you ask a preacher to distinguish between preaching and a lecture, they would not be able to do it. A preaching and a lecture may sound very similar at points, but I would argue that the one is a theological act of God. The other one is a human act. What I am doing now is not a theological act of God. Preaching is God speaking, addressing, calling into existence his people as the minister stands and proclaims the word. There's a reason why the pulpit behind me is elevated in a Protestant church. Assume probably on a Sunday when you have the Lord's Supper, the table is below the pulpit. Because the preaching is the central and most important thing of all the important things that take place in worship. Preaching is critical. So the first thing I want to suggest as part of the answer to the modern problem is this. Get a theology of preaching. Understand what's going on in preaching. Understand that when the word is preached, God is the agent. That's important to remember. That lifts a burden off our shoulders because it means it is not down to us. It is God's action that is important. Secondly, I think preachers need to teach the truth of God as a comprehensive whole. One of the things I think that is wonderful about the great confessions of the 16th and 17th centuries is this. They present the truth of God as a sweeping whole. If you get hold of the Belgic Confession, or you get hold of the Westminster Confession of Faith, or you get hold of the Second London Confession of Faith, the Baptist Confession of Faith, or you get hold of the Augsburg Confession, the Book of Concord, what do you have there? You have a summary of biblical teaching, but not just a summary of biblical teaching. You have a summary of biblical teaching where all the parts are connected to all the other parts. And you can see how things connect as a whole. Why is that important? I think that is important for teaching sexual morality, for example. Sexual morality is often being taught in the church as a set of do's and don'ts. Those do's and don'ts, though, only really make sense when they're set against the background of a broader, more comprehensive theology. I was just being interviewed by Reformatorische Dagblad and was asked a question on sexual morality, and I made the comment that the do's and don'ts of the Bible need to be set against anthropology. Why does God forbid certain sexual acts? It isn't simply because he is an arbitrary tyrant who has decided that certain physically possible acts are immoral. It's because those acts fly in the face of much broader teaching about what it means to be a human being. So my second point is this. Teaching of Christian doctrine needs to be sweeping, comprehensive. Pastors need to show how different doctrines connect to each other. Pastors need to show how Christian ethics connect to Christian theology proper. One of the great problems we face in the West is this. In some ways, we've been the victims of our own success. What do I mean by that? Well, when I was growing up in the 1970s and 80s, many things relative to sexual morality that were taught in the Bible were also assumed by the wider culture. The secular culture, the morality of the sexual culture, essentially paralleled that of the Bible, reflected that of the Bible. It had become detached in wider culture from its biblical moorings, but that basic social imaginary was informed by biblical teaching. My parents were not Christians, but I remember in 1978, I think it was, or 79, we went on holiday to a hotel in North Wales, and my mother discovered that a young couple staying in the hotel were not married, but were in the same room. My mum was not a Christian, and that absolutely horrified her. She was horrified by that. I went to an all-boys grammar school in the United Kingdom. Nobody at my school thought homosexuality was correct. It was just assumed it was wrong. Well, track to the present day. The social imaginary of the world in which we live has changed dramatically. Suddenly, Christian morality is antithetical to the moral imagination of the broader social imaginary. And I think that has left particularly Protestants in a very difficult position, because we haven't thought in great detail about the integration of theology and ethics in a way that we need to. And so, my second point is this: we need to teach Christian doctrine as the foundation of Christian ethics. It's interesting, I'm a church historian. When you look at Protestantism, the Protestant world is packed with people with PhDs in church history, packed with PhDs in New Testament, packed with, to a lesser extent, but still quite a lot of PhDs in Old Testament, biblical theology, ethics. I'm hard-pressed to think of more than 4 or 5 good Protestant ethicists from the last 40, 50 years. It's a real lack in Protestantism. And I think it comes from the fact that we got lazy because the wider culture carried the weight for us for so long. I'd also suggest this, my third point, and it kind of touches on the second. Different ages in church history. We have to teach the whole counsel of God in every age. Different ages in church history present different problems. 4th century raises the issue of the relationship between the Father and the Son in eternity in an acute form. And it leads to the formulation of Trinitarian doctrine at the Council of Constantinople in 381. 5th century raises the issue subsequent to Constantinople of the relationship between the divine and human natures in the person of the Lord Jesus Christ. Leads to the Chalcedonian formula of 451. Theology proper, Christology, they were the dominant issues of the time. They were the issues that preoccupied the greatest minds of the time. We move to the 16th and 17th centuries. Authority, sacraments, closely connected to those two things, justification. These are the things that preoccupy the greatest minds of the day. Those were the pressing issues of the church. Today, what is the pressing issue? Anthropology. Without a shadow of a doubt, it's anthropology. The question, what is a woman, is only difficult to answer if you've lost sight of the deeper question of what does it mean to be a human being. Anthropology is the pressing issue of the day. I would say to pastors and to elders and church leaders, when you think about your Christian education programs, when you think about your preaching, anthropology is key. It's very interesting that that book that was just being presented clearly touches on anthropology. And although I didn't set Lawrence up to ask that question, he asked the question, why didn't you deal with transgenderism, etc., etc.? And the answer came back, I'm summarizing here, was essentially, well, we wanted to go for anthropology. We wanted to go for the big thing on which these other problems fall. And it's wonderful how going for the big positive doctrines helps you when the craziness comes along. Round about 2014, 2015, there were rumblings, not in my denomination, but in another conservative Presbyterian denomination in the United States. Do we need to add something to the Westminster Confession to deal with the issue of gay marriage? Well, you probably all know the answer to that. No, we don't. Why not? The Westminster Divines would never have imagined that gay marriage would be a thing. But they did know what marriage was. And they present a positive teaching of what marriage is, thereby excluding everything that marriage isn't, without having to specify it. I think as a church, if we spend our time trying to second guess what the next crazy thing will be and addressing it, we will always be out of date. If we teach positively what it means to be a human being, then we already have the place to stand, which will allow us to deal with any counterfeits that come along. So the first thing is the need for teaching and catechesis. Secondly, I think properly ordered worship. I think we typically as Christians often underestimate the power of the Christian worship service. Now go back to the very first point I made when I said this is a battle. It's not just a battle about arguments. It's a battle for the imagination. Where is the Christian imagination most powerfully formed? I love Tolkien, but it isn't most powerfully formed when you read Tolkien or C.S. Lewis. The Christian imagination is most powerfully formed in the worship service. That's where all of our being is engaged. I think about the worship service in the way that I think perhaps about classes at school. I studied classics, same university, the great University of Cambridge, the same university as Sharon. I can read Latin and Greek. I have almost no recollection whatsoever of any individual class in Latin or Greek I ever took. The only classes I remember are where somebody was fooling around. It was nothing to do with what was being taught. It was what rules were being broken. And yet I know Latin and Greek. My mind was incrementally formed over many years of study to the point where it was a fundamentally different mind to the one that I began with. So the first thing I want to say about worship is this. If we want to transform people's minds, the worship service must be a priority. And that's particularly, I think, the case for parents with children. Don't do anything as parents that would lead your children to think that the worship service on a Sunday is not the most important gathering they go to during the week. It's a Roman Catholic archbishop that I heard lecture a few years ago, become a dear friend actually over the years because of various religious freedom things in which he was engaged in Philadelphia. But I heard the then Archbishop of Philadelphia giving a lecture on the church, and somebody stood up at the end and asked one of those questions, which was more of a statement, saying, isn't the fact that the church is losing its young people, doesn't that come down to the fact that the church needs to move with the times? And without taking a breath, the Archbishop responded. He said, I will tell you why we have lost our young people. And he said, we have lost our young people because my generation and your generation did not teach our young people the church was the most important thing in their lives. And he followed it up with in America, this would be a real gut punch. He said, if you take your children to a ball game on a Sunday instead of going to worship, you are teaching your children that ball games are more important than worship is. Now, he's a Roman Catholic. I've got a lot of problems with Roman Catholicism. But the logic of that answer seems to me to be impeccable. We need to teach our children that worship is the great non-negotiable of the week. Secondly, I think we need to think about the structure of worship. What is it that shapes the imagination? It isn't simply getting together in a room. It's the rhythm and the content of what goes on there. First of all, I would say corporate singing. You might say, well, corporate singing, well, why is that a big deal? Well, let me give you a little case study in the social imaginary. I talked about the importance of technology. One of the things about music is this. Music has historically existed to bind communities together. Music developed, it was always live because there was no way of recording it and storing it. Music was always live, it was always communal, and it existed to do things like celebrate a birth, celebrate a wedding. It existed to lament a death, or lament, as the Psalms do, lament exile, lament corporate suffering. Think of the African American spiritual tradition. To lament as a people, a common experience of suffering. Music was a corporate thing. Now think about the social imaginary. What does that do? Well, when you sing corporately, you can't be an independent human being. You have to sing in coordination with everybody else. You sing freely, but you sing the same tune and you sing the same words. My Dutch is not very good, but it seemed to me that when we sang the Dutch psalm earlier, all of you Dutch people here sang the same words. You weren't scat singing. You weren't doing your own thing. You were being bound together. Now think about music in modern culture. How do most of us experience music most of the time? As individuals. We put in our earbuds and we listen to music as a way of isolating ourselves from others. What does it mean when something that is specifically developed to bind communities together inverts its purpose and becomes that which actually turns us into individuals? I'm not sure I can fully articulate what I'm getting at here, but it seems to me that has to be significant. If music is something that has historically reminded us that we are not isolated, autonomous individuals, then we need to recover that. Where do we recover that? Well, football matches, rugby matches, but most powerfully in the church. When we sing corporately in the church, the very fact that we're singing, before we even get to the content of what we're singing, the very fact that we are singing contains an anthropology. And don't forget, of course, that who is it that brings corporate singing back into the church? Martin Luther. For Luther, the whole church is to sing. It was an important part of the transformation that took place at the Reformation, that the whole church should sing, because Luther knew that was anthropologically and theologically significant. So when we think about worship, incrementally shapes the imagination. Secondly, I want to say corporate singing shapes our imaginations in ways that we're probably unaware of. When I get onto a plane on Friday, if I'm not sitting by my wife, I kind of hope that somebody puts earbuds in, because it means I can read my book. They're not going to try to talk to me. I'm an antisocial sort of guy. But I'll also be aware that, well, music is being used there to do the exact opposite of what music was intended for. It's being used to separate us into individuals. Where do we come back as a people, as a corporate people? The church. Singing is very important to the corporate identity of the church and to the social imaginary of the Christian. We should also think about the rhythm of the liturgy. Probably a variety of denominations, a variety of liturgical traditions represented here. Some will have more formal written liturgies, others perhaps have what appears, at least on the surface, to be a freer form of worship, but probably follows a similar structure week after week after week. In other words, it's an unwritten liturgy. Think about what liturgy does. Talk here about the liturgy of my own denomination. We don't have an elaborate written liturgy, but we have a directory for public worship, which means every church in my denomination has to do certain things in a worship service for it to be a properly constituted worship service. It begins with a call to worship. The minister will call the people into the presence of God, reminding them of who God is and who they are. He will then call upon God to bless the gathering. At some point early in the service, there will be a passage read from Scripture which speaks about God's holiness and the demands that places upon the creatures, us, made in his image. It reminds us that we are sinners. He will then lead the congregation in a prayer of confession, after which he will read from the Word of God an assurance of forgiveness. Then there will be a corporate prayer in which the minister brings the needs, the thanksgivings and the needs of the whole body before God in prayer. Then there will be another reading of the word. And then the minister will expound that word and apply it to the people. Then there will be a hymn or a psalm of response where the people respond in repentance and gratitude for what has been preached. And then the minister will raise his arms and will dismiss the people with a blessing. Think about that. What does that worship service represent? It embodies the drama of the gospel. It embodies creation, fall, redemption, reconciliation. It's powerful. It enacts the gospel. When you experience that service week after week after week, it shapes your imagination. It shapes your expectations. It shapes your understanding of who you are. The rhythm of the liturgy is very important. It reminds us of what it means to be a human being. And this is very important, good liturgies are teleological. I've not used that word yet in these lectures, but I would say one of the big problems of how human beings understand themselves today is they have no teleology. There is no end to being a human being. We invent our ends for ourselves. Good Christian worship is teleological in that it points you towards man's chief end, to glorify God and enjoy him forever. Worship has a structure that goes somewhere, that takes us somewhere, that reminds us that our destiny as Christian people is heaven, that tells us that what we are experiencing in the worship service is a kind of anticipation of heaven itself on earth, of all things put right. That's powerful. There's a good reason why the great classic liturgies of both West and East, towards the close of the evening service, have what we call, and it's actually Latin, but we call it in English, the Nunc Dimittis, Simeon's song, "Now you may dismiss your servant in peace." The idea is that the worship service has confronted people with God and their destiny in him, and now they should be prepared to die in peace. It's teleology. A worship service I was speaking somewhere and a young man put his hand up and he said, "But I go to a church," I don't know if this translates into Dutch or what he says, "I go to a church where the worship service is a TED talk followed by a Coldplay concert." And I certainly wanted to say to the young man, well, if the gospel is preached in your church, you need to be grateful. Your minister is no doubt trying to be faithful. But what a wasted opportunity. What a wasted opportunity. I can tell immediately when somebody describes worship like that there's no structure, there's no narrative, there's no teleology underlying it. We need to think about, how do we bring up our young people to think correctly about sexuality and gender? I think it starts in the worship service, when the very rhythm and structure of the service itself teaches our young people what it means to be a human being made in God's image and redeemed in Christ. That brings me then finally to my third point, way of life. And this, I think, is where the church has a tremendous opportunity. We've got to have the teaching correct. We've got to have our creed correct. We've got to have our worship or our cult correct. We also have to have the way we live our lives correct too. We need to embody what true humanity looks like every day of the week. There are many things one could say about this. I want to highlight just two at the moment because they're two that I think are critically important and actually pretty easy. They're within the grasp of us all to some extent. We need as a church to recapture the concept of friendship. Conscious that my late great friend Willem van Asselt, who was a great Coxeus scholar, would often talk about Coxeus' writings on the amicitia Dei, the friendship of God. One of the relational attributes of God, I think, is friendship. We're told in Exodus that when Moses met with God in the tabernacle, in the tent of meeting, there God would speak to Moses face to face, as a man speaks to his friend. That's picked up, I think, in the upper room discourse when Jesus Christ, telling his disciples that he's about to depart from them, and they're getting depressed. He says to them, but no longer do I call you servants, I call you friends. God is a friend of his people. We need to reflect that in the way we relate to each other. I would say one of the general crises in our culture today is a crisis in friendship. Why is the LGBTQ community so powerful? Well, there are many reasons for that, but one of them, I think, is this. It offers friendship to people. It does offer a form of community, friendly community that has been lost in many other places. It's filling a vacuum. I was at a conference just yesterday, day before, and one of the lectures given was a brilliant lecture arguing against the idea that David and Jonathan are in a homosexual or homoerotic relationship. What's fascinating about that lecture is one would not have had to have given it prior to 1978. That was the very first time that idea was ever floated, apparently, in church history. Why was it floated then? Well, the gay rights movement was rising. Why is it the case today that anybody preaching on that passage, and I include myself in this because I have preached on that passage, the very first point you're going to address in your sermon is going to be whether it's a gay relationship or not? The reason is we've lost sight of what friendship is. In the 19th century, they knew what friendship was. The language that David and Jonathan used about each other was not unusual. It was the language of friendship. It didn't need to be explained because the concept was there. Again, an example I've used numerous times, but I was talking to a young life worker, one of the Christian workers in my college who goes into high schools to speak to young people about the gospel. And I was asking him, what problems are you facing? And he said, well, one problem is that in the class of 13 to 14-year-old girls that I'm talking to at the moment, he said, 80% of them say they're lesbians. That's an amazing proportion. That's way beyond even the most exaggerated figures for same-sex attraction in the wider culture. And I asked him, why is that? And he said 2 reasons. One, being straight just isn't cool. That's plausible. Teenagers like to be cool, like to belong, don't like to stand out. And he said, and the other reason is they don't know what friendship is. 2 young girls have powerful affection for each other, and people in my generation tell them they're lesbians. They don't tell them that's because she's your best friend, and that's how friends think about each other. We give them a sexual lens to understand what 50 years ago would have been unexceptional, normal, passionate and deep human relationships. The church needs to recapture the notion of friendship. I think one of the responsibilities that falls on the older generation is to model to the younger generation what true friendship looks like. We're raising a generation of young people who don't know what friends are. They think friends are people they've never met that they connect to on Facebook. That's not friendship. By the way, that's why I would say never refer to somebody as a friend that you haven't actually met in the flesh at some point. That's a good kind of rule of thumb for trying to keep friendship relatively serious. We need to model friendship. We also, I think, need to model hospitality. One of the tragic side effects of the sexual revolution, of which Shulamith Firestone is a great example. They only find that she's died because the smell of her body is permeating the other apartments. She dies old and alone. One of the tragedies of the sexual revolution is loneliness. I say to students, it's interesting that the New York Times never profiles 80-year-old swingers. The New York Times will give all of these positive presentations of crazy sexual lifestyles, but they're always people under 50, it seems. Why? Well, because 80-year-old swingers are broken and alone. They're lonely and pathetic. If Hugh Hefner couldn't pull it off with all his money and power, nobody can pull it off. We're living in a society where the loneliness epidemic is only going to get worse. And that's where I think the church can speak powerfully through its hospitality. I'm sure many of us, if not all of us here, have been recipients of hospitality in our time. You probably remember the names of the people who gave you hospitality because it's powerful and important. I'm a Presbyterian in part because when I went to do my PhD in Aberdeen, I arrived in the city and I was all on my own. I went to a Presbyterian church on the first Sunday, and the little old lady, Effie Morrison, in the pew in front of me, turned round and invited me to lunch. That was nearly 40 years ago, and I still remember her name to this day because she was kind and hospitable to me. Think about the Bible. Hospitality is another attribute of God, relative attribute of God, isn't it? I am the Lord your God who loves the widow, the orphan, and the sojourner. You too should love the sojourner, for you were once sojourners in Egypt. What's God saying there? I would say, the foundation of Old Testament ethics is what? I am a hospitable God. Therefore, you who reflect my character, you who are made in my image, should be hospitable too. Hospitality is powerful. We should not underestimate it. And of course, it's anthropological. Hospitality lies at the heart of biblical anthropology. If the problem of today's world is independence, isolation, and autonomy, what does hospitality do? It embodies the dependencies and obligations that human beings have towards each other. When you open your home to somebody, you're acknowledging that you're not an island. You're giving them hospitality, but you benefit from it too. It was wonderful last night at Lauren's house to sit on a grate in the sunshine as well. So a long table full of new and interesting people I'd never met before. Had some wonderful conversation about American politics, to the extent that conversation about American politics can ever be wonderful. I had them last night. And as I came away, I thought, wasn't that wonderful? It was a special evening that I will always remember because somebody offered me hospitality. We sat around a family table and something special takes place at that point. So my third point is this. If the church wishes to address the crisis of anthropology, of which the LGBTQ movement is merely a symptom, then the church needs to teach properly, she needs to worship properly, and she needs to manifest hospitality and friendship in the way she engages both those within the church and those out with the church. Thank you for listening so patiently. That's it.